Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Travis Hoffman. I serve as the North Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota Extension Sheep Specialist. I'm excited that we have two of our talented colleagues to help to describe some of their experiences and some of their thoughts and some of the technologies that we have as we focus on both sheep and goats. Their title for this evening's function is Managing for Reproductive Success in Sheep and Goats. And so we are joined by Dr. Rachel Gibbs. She is the NDSU Livestock Extension Specialist and based in Hettinger, North Dakota. So she's in the southwest corner of our state in North Dakota. Also, we have Dr. Lacey Quail. Lacey is also a NDSU Livestock Extension Specialist. She joins us from Minot, North Dakota. So appreciate their experiences. Lacey grew up in South Dakota, the Promised Land. Appreciate her efforts as well. And Rachel Gibbs originates from Texas. And so two talented and experts within our field, and we're excited to share this. We actually held an in-person workshop in Hettinger, North Dakota, and I really appreciated what they did and what they brought for us, and I'm thankful that they joined us for this evening's function to talk about reproduction and how to get to successes. So I hope you enjoy it. We look forward to your questions, your interaction, and discussion. Please feel free to put those questions into the chat box, and we will reach on those as it so fits, and hopefully at the end of our function. And we will pass this on. Okay, and so Dr. Rachel Gibbs will lead us off, and then back to Lacey, and then back to Rachel. Tag, you're it, Dr. Gibbs.
Perfect. Thanks, Travis. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to speak tonight. I know that Lacey and I always get pretty excited when we get to talk about reproduction. And in particular for me, I really enjoy small ruminant reproduction. And so we're excited to get to share some information related to pre-breeding management and then some estrus synchronization protocols and the importance of understanding those products that go into those protocols. And then, of course, if you're interested in incorporating artificial insemination, there's some considerations to make when determining what technique to use, as well as when you're purchasing semen and utilizing specialized techniques. And so tonight, I think we'll start with some of the considerations that we can start making as soon as 60 days prior to the breeding season. And when we think about pre-breeding considerations, we're not only preparing those breeding stock for the breeding season in order to conceive and maintain a pregnancy, but we're also preparing them to be successful throughout the rest of the production year. As those nutritional demands and demands of the production season increase throughout pregnancy and in late gestation and lactation. And so when we think about the importance of the pre-breeding management phase, we're talking about the 60 days prior to the breeding season. Is particularly important when we start to think about some factors that influence reproductive outcomes. And really, we're talking about making some management decisions prior to the breeding season that set those females and males up for success and increase or maintain reproductive performance in our operations. And from a foundational level, I think nutrition plays probably a really important role, a critical role in maintaining reproductive performance. From a nutrition standpoint, in a biological standpoint, nutrition really drives a lot of our reproductive outcomes. And we evaluate that based on nutritional status and body condition score. We're trying to enter the breeding season on this positive energy balance. And so we'll start tonight's discussion with a few strategies that can be deployed during this pre-breeding season to increase those odds and reproductive rates in our operations. And then move into some female cyclicity and synchronization protocols that Lacey will talk to us a little bit about. And then finally, move into incorporating artificial insemination and the techniques and success rates that are involved in those different techniques. And so when we think about reproductive success and improving or maintaining this in our operations, nutrition is a critical driver of that, and the impact of that nutrition really varies on the stage of production. I think if we take a look at the energy requirements throughout the production year, you can see that there's some ebbs and flows, particularly on the female side, when those energy requirements are the greatest in late lactation or peak lactation. And where we start to see often remissed or overlooked is this requirement of energy during the pre-breeding season that primes that female to create or develop a healthy gamete that's receptive to fertilization to improve conception rates. And so as we take a look at how nutrition drives reproductive success and other stages of production, it's important to recognize that nutrition during the pre-breeding phase really drives ovulation rates and conception rates. Whereas when we move into early gestation, we're more focused on that nutrition driving embryo survival and the establishment of pregnancy. And then in mid-gestation is a peak time where we're seeing this critical tissue development of the placenta, which is responsible for transporting those nutrients during peak fetal growth in late gestation and throughout pregnancy, and promoting lamb survival in late gestation. Very similar on the ram side, we see some differences primarily related to the breeding season. We know that pre-breeding nutrition has significant and direct impacts on semen quality about 60 days prior to the breeding season. And then during the breeding season, nutrition is really driving our breeding activity and our ram's ability to meet the demands of a highly demanding breeding season. And we think about why is nutrition important to reproductive outcomes, and when we evaluate nutritional status and their impact on reproductive outcomes, we know that underconditioned and overconditioned breeding stock have a slew of consequences. And in particular, when we think on the female side, we're losing natural cyclicity and that hormonal regulation of ovulation, which can directly impact conception and establishment of pregnancy. We also have increased embryonic loss in our underconditioned ewes that probably need a couple more body condition score units or an increase in nutrition to support that pregnancy. Similarly, on the ram side, we tend to see underconditioned bucks or with a body condition score of less than 2 being weaker and unable to breed as efficiently as those in an ideal body condition score. They also exhibit probably the biggest consequence to them is their poor semen quality that's notably different in underconditioned bucks. And then similarly on the overconditioned side, we have a reduced response to nutritional flushing and nutritional changes in management. We have reduced response to synchronization protocols and also have some hormonal dysregulation that disrupts cyclicity on the female side. And then, of course, one of the bigger problems, especially in late gestation, is this increased risk of metabolic disease and ketosis and pregnancy toxemia. On the ram side, typically our overconditioned rams are generally going to have a lack of breeding activity or reduced libido, reduced response to that flushing or nutritional management. And so when we think about incorporating these ideas and making sure that we're in optimal breeding condition, we really need to start evaluating our body condition scores about 60 days before the breeding season in order to allow us time to make changes, nutritional adjustments to get them into an ideal body condition. In sheep and goats, I think many of us are aware that we evaluate body condition and nutritional status using a body condition scoring system from 1 to 5. And this is a physical appraisal and sometimes a visual assessment of fat and muscle cover over the spine and the rib edge or the transverse process. And this is a 5-point scale with 1s indicating extremely thin or emaciated animals and 5 representing overconditioned animals, which we just talked about, both of those conditions being not ideal for reproductive outcomes. When we think about how we can, another way to measure nutritional status, and in particular when we start to try and make adjustments from a nutritional standpoint, to increase a body condition score unit, we're typically looking at a 10 to 15% body weight gain or loss. And so on a 150-pound ewe, that can be an 8 to 15-pound weight adjustment if we need to increase her from a 2 to a 3 to be in an ideal breeding condition heading into that breeding season. Similarly, on our ram side, we're typically managing those out of season in a 2.5 to a 3, and they oftentimes need to increase to a 3 to a 3.5 in order to avoid excess loss during the breeding season. We can see up to one body condition score loss, or a 10 to 15% loss in body weight during the breeding season on the ram side. And so having those into a 3 and a 3.5 body condition score will kind of set them up for success through a challenging or demanding breeding season, depending on the number of ewes per, or number of females per ram or buck. Additionally, on the ram management side, the reason that we find 60 days as an important factor is because semen quality and really the sperm production cycle is a 48 to 55 day process. And so if we need to identify subfertile rams prior to the breeding season, we really need to start making nutritional adjustments, as well as evaluating their reproductive soundness prior to the breeding season in at least 60 days in order to see that effect at the start of the breeding season. Typically, we see an increase in plant and nutrition for rams during this period. They require an increase in dry matter intake, a 10% increase in energy requirements, an 18% increase in protein requirements, and ultimately we're trying to target this 3 to 3.5 body condition score for them to not only have increased sperm production, but also optimal and productive semen quality. Additionally, beyond nutritional management, 60 days prior to the breeding season, we can utilize breeding soundness exams to estimate reproductive soundness and identify subfertile rams prior to the breeding season. This is typically done in conjunction with a veterinarian, and oftentimes we're primarily looking to assess fertility, but also overall health status as well. These include an assessment of reproductive organs, as well as semen quality. And then you can also perform some different disease screening options, such as Brucella ovis testing, and to prevent the spread of that, particularly important if you're bringing in new rams that you're less experienced with that ram or that genetics of that ram from a scrapie standpoint as well. And then finally, evaluating structural soundness of feet and legs and mouth as well to make sure that those animals are in optimal condition to be able to withstand a 45 to 60 day breeding season. On the female side, I think this was probably one that is really effective in terms of increasing reproductive success is priming females with nutritional supplementation prior to the breeding season, anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. Now, this period can be extended if we have ewes that are in poor body condition. So that's why we recommend the 60-day body condition score evaluation, so we can sort and feed animals to their individual requirements. If we need to put weight on some, we can do that if we've evaluated that 60 days ahead of time. Priming females or flushing females has been shown to increase ovulation rates and subsequent conception rates. Typically, this includes a 50 to 100% increase in nutrient requirements, and primarily we're doing that through the use of energy supplements over protein supplements. During this time, we're hoping to improve body condition score from maintenance conditions of a 2 to 2.5 to a 2.5 to a 3, and gaining 5 to 10 pounds on about a 150-pound ewe or doe. But the other advantage here is we're putting these ewes in a positive energy balance where they're gaining weight rather than losing weight, which is really effective when we start to think about nutrient availability for hormone cyclicity that I know Lacey will touch on as well. Flushing has been shown to improve conception rates by about 25%. However, it is less effective for ewes or does in a body condition score of a 3 and above. They typically are already in optimal nutritional status, and you're going to see less of that nutritional response and conception rate response versus a ewe that's in maintenance condition prior to the breeding season, about 2 and a 2.5 body condition score. Some supplementation strategies for flushing, keeping in mind that we're essentially doubling the energy requirements during this 2 to 4 week phase. And oftentimes forages alone are not necessarily able to meet those requirements. And so oftentimes producers will utilize cereal grain supplementation at a half to a pound per head per day to increase those energy availability and increase cyclicity and conception rates. Also common is the use of fortified energy and protein supplements that are fortified with specific trace mineral requirements that are species specific. This has been really effective, but there's some costs that are associated with that, depending on availability in your region. But most importantly, we want to make sure that we're balancing these supplements with the base ration and providing no more than 16% protein, as that's been shown to reduce conception rate. Dietary protein, it can also, greater than 16% can also lead to the risk of increase in pistol rot or an infection of the sheath around the penis due to increased nitrogen secretion in the urine. And so keeping that crude protein level below 16% is essential prior to breeding season. And then, of course, we're making sure that we're balancing critical micronutrients for reproduction, which is really why I like the use of fortified energy and protein supplements, because they're typically fortified with additional selenium and vitamin E that have been shown to promote not only semen quality, but also female production as well. And then, of course, zinc and manganese also play biological roles in those processes of sperm production and oocyte development. So when we summarize the key pieces of the pre-breeding season, it's really important that we evaluate nutritional status and enough time to make a nutritional adjustments in order to target those ideal body condition scores prior to the breeding season. This gives us time to sort off females or males that are in poor body condition score and feed them to their individual needs. And then secondly, we want to enter the breeding season in a positive energy balance by increasing plain nutrition at least 2 to 4 weeks prior to the breeding season and use by either 50 to 100% of maintenance requirements. And then, of course, increasing plain nutrition and nutrition availability in our rams 6 to 8 weeks to target semen production and semen quality prior to the breeding season. And then finally, testing ram or buck reproductive soundness is a really critical step to identify subfertile males, which can be really important as we start to make economic decisions related to keeping reproductively unsound livestock. So I think now Lacey will kind of move into why nutrition plays such a big role in cyclicity, and perhaps talk a little bit about how we can utilize ester synchronization to improve reproductive success.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Rachel. She did a great job at addressing a lot of nutritional concerns and demands that we have for our sheep and goats, and she mentioned how closely interrelated nutrition and reproduction are, and that's 100% the truth. They are very much intertwined, and the best visual representation that maybe we could put together on this is something called the biological order of nutrient partitioning. And the idea here is that nutrients kind of fill a need, and until that need is filled, they can't, a sheep or a goat or any animal can't move on to kind of shuttling nutrients to the next need. So first and foremost, they're going to put those nutrients towards just basic survival, right? That metabolism, being able to walk to and from the water tank, graze, and only after those nutrition requirements are met, then we can think about growth. Only after growth is met can then we think about adding maybe body condition to an animal. And you'll notice that at the very bottom of this kind of inverted pyramid is anything related to reproduction, right? So only after basic needs are met, growth needs are met, even putting on body condition is met, then we're going at the very last kind of order of operation here is cyclicity. And so nutrients get devoted to several other aspects of production before reproduction. And so that's why it is so critical to have your nutrition and your management of nutrition dialed in so that we can be successful reproductively. So that kind of leads us right into understanding the estrous cycle and understanding how hormones work, and that typically can be kind of a complicated discussion, right? And hormones are complicated in the fact that they affect a lot when it comes to production, and nutritionally if an animal is not in proper body condition, it's going to really hinder the production of hormones. So when we think about hormones, there are complicated cascades and what behaviors they kind of initiate in an animal. But I think we fail to forget that we actually see hormones in work every day, right? We walk out to the barn and we can see a hormone working. And so that these pictures here kind of illustrate that, right? If you put rams together or bucks together, they're going to be kind of sizing each other up, or you might see a ram following ewes with his lips curled up in the flamin response. Those are all behaviors, or both behaviors, that are in response to testosterone. We think about late pregnant ewes or does. Maybe they have kind of some of that nesting behavior, right, where they're pawing at straw, trying to get comfortable. We see progesterone in action there. During lambing or kidding, there is a whole host of hormones that have to work in concert with one another to get that job done. So cortisol and prostaglandin both really help initiate and carry through labor, while oxytocin is that bonding hormone that's going to be really pretty pivotal for the relationship between that lamb and that ewe, and making sure she knows which one's hers. And then prolactin, when a lamb nurses, not only is that further cementing that bond, and oxytocin is released then, but prolactin is responsible for milk letdown, right? So it's pretty easy to see how many hormones there are and how many behaviors they're responsible for. So that kind of leads us in, well, how do they elicit that behavior, right? How are they responsible for those behaviors? And this is something that is complicated in itself, but I wanted to try to illustrate that in kind of a lock and key sort of illustration, right? So think of the hormone as the key, and the receptor, or what it binds to in the animal, as the lock. And you have to find the right match. And so these are three hormones that I'm going to focus on through the rest of my portion of this presentation, just because they are pretty important when we think about their role in synchronization protocols. And they're all going to be the same color throughout. So if you're someone who appreciates color coding, just keep looking for the same colors throughout. But for example, we have progesterone, and you notice I put up a cedar there, as that's a source of progesterone when we think about synchronization. And I also have the structure, right? So each hormone has its own shape and size. And so the blue triangles represent progesterone, and they're only going to fit into the receptors that are blue triangles, right? And so that's just kind of a simplified version of a hormone is going to initiate a behavior, or it's going to initiate its role in an animal by reacting with its own receptor. And that's a very unique, specific relationship between a hormone and its receptor, because as you can see from those structures, they're all different sizes and all different shapes. So that kind of leads us right into what we use them for. And I think if you go to the next slide, Rachel, the easiest answer to that is controlling cyclicity, or controlling what's happening on the ovary. So when we think about a ewe or a doe, they're going to be ovulating, right? And ovulating means that they're releasing an egg cell in hopes that it gets fertilized. And we can use these hormones as a way to control what's already happening in those females. So it's a natural process that's occurring in these females, and we can use hormones to control exactly when that's happening. And if you think ahead to using AI, or just coming up into your breeding season, if we can control when ovulation is happening, we can control maybe the exact timing of AI and have the best success that we can with AI. Or it might be that your goal is just to have more lambs or kids born in a more concentrated time period. So you have more uniform groups that you can market and kind of benefit from that. Okay, so to really understand that question of what we use these products and hormones for, what we use synchronization for, I mentioned that it's to control the estrous cycle, right? And we can't really learn how to do that until we understand what the estrus cycle is. And so the next several slides, I'm going to walk through just exactly what that is and all the different moving parts. This is definitely set up like a row of dominoes. You knock over one and a bunch more knock over. And so it's really critical to kind of understand these time points because it really impacts what hormones are going to be at play and what part of the cycle an animal is going to be in. So if we think about reproductive success, we have to understand it before we want to try to control it and benefit from some of that synchronization. So the first thing I need to mention is that an estrus cycle is the time period from one period of estrus to another. So that picture is actually a picture of rams, vasectomized rams in with a bunch of ewes. So we're heat detecting those ewes. And of course, when they mount the ewe in heat, that cran gets rubbed off and we can tell which ewes are in heat. So that's just a representation of what estrus is, which is just the receptivity of a ewe or a doe to be bred. And so you have that at the very beginning. That marks the very beginning of a cycle. And so in this picture, it's bookended by periods of breeding receptivity. So that's kind of a behavior that we can notice, right? We can go out to the barn and we can see that behavior. The next little graphic there we have is an egg cell being released from a follicle. And that's something we can't see, right? So that's internally what's going on. But I put them side by side because they happen pretty coincidentally with each other. It's a matter of hours between when a ewe or a doe is in heat and when that oocyte is gonna, or that egg cell is going to be released or ovulation. And so they're pretty stacked up pretty close to one another. And so that's the animated pictures are going to be things that we can't see with our eyes, but they're what's happening on the ovary internally. So just because on the bookend, right? So during periods of estrus and ovulation happens on either end of the cycle. And I should mention that in sheep, an estrus cycle is on average 18 days long, versus in goats, the estrus cycle is an average of 21 days long. So we have a sheep example up here, but it wouldn't be very much different if we were to talk through the doe estrus cycle. So just because that ovulation is happening on either end of that estrus cycle, that doesn't mean that nothing is going on in the middle of that cycle. So on the ovary, if we have that follicle releasing an egg cell on either end of the cycle, in the middle of the cycle, we have another structure. And so that's the yellow structure you see there, and it's called the corpus luteum, which if it helps you remember, that's Latin for yellow body. And so that's why it's yellow there in that picture. And you'll see a little bit later why it's even called that. So that structure in itself prevents any more egg cells from being released, prevents ovulation. And so you're kind of seeing a concert effect here, right? Where one structure is preventing ovulation. The other structure is responsible or part of that ovulation. And so there's a give and a take here when we think about estrus cyclicity. Okay, so here's some pictures of ovaries actually at different time points of the estrus cycle. And so in that first picture on the left, those are follicles, and you'll notice that they look hollow, right? So they have fluid in them, but they're hollow. It's kind of like a I don't know if you think about it like a water balloon sort of situation. Whereas after that follicle ruptures and releases that egg cell at ovulation, it transforms itself into that corpus luteum. And if you notice in that picture, it does look yellow or almost orange. And so that's where it gets its name from. And so this is just, before we get into the nitty-gritty of hormones, we need to kind of understand what's even going on the ovary, because these structures produce hormones. And so if we have a different structure on the ovary at a certain time, we know maybe what point of the cycle that ewe or doe is in, and that's going to matter for what hormones or what type of synchronization we use. Okay, so now getting into the different hormones that are involved in the estrus cycle. This first one I put up is estradiol or estrogen. And so that behavior that we see or can physically see of ewes that are receptive to breeding, that's a behavior that's caused by estrogen. And so you'll notice that estrogen peaks at those time points where a ewe or a doe is in heat. But the rest of the cycle, it's very low. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. The next hormone is called LH, or luteinizing hormone. And so that's the hormone that is actually responsible for releasing that egg cell. And so it makes sense that it's going to be a pretty steep peak of that hormone around the same time when that structure on the ovary is releasing the egg cell. All right, the next hormone is progesterone. And so this hormone, you'll notice, is low on those ends of the cycle, but it's high for the majority of it. So in the middle of the cycle, progesterone is high, and that yellow body, that corpus luteum that we talked about, it's actually responsible for producing or making that progesterone. So as long as there's that corpus luteum, that yellow body present on the ovary, if that structure is there, there's going to be high levels of progesterone. And if you remember, I mentioned that as long as that structure was there, we're not going to be releasing any egg cells, right? So progesterone inhibits ovulation or inhibits those egg cells from being released. Okay, so the natural life cycle or lifespan, I should say, of that yellow body, it doesn't last forever. In order for this to be a cycle, it has to continue over and over. And so the last hormone that we're going to talk about is called prostaglandin, and it's responsible for killing that corpus luteum or making it inactive so that progesterone is not produced anymore. And by initiating that, it turns into, instead of a yellow body, it looks more like a scar. And so it's inactive and it's not producing progesterone. And that's what kind of naturally ends the cycle, to where if you're putting the pieces together, if progesterone is gone, we don't have anything to inhibit ovulation anymore. So that's why you'll see right after that, we have another chance for ovulation to occur and another egg cell to be released. So I know that was a lot of moving parts, and we don't need to remember all of it right away. The point is to put it all together and look at the big picture here. So when you see it all together, the main takeaways here are, notice that all these hormones aren't all high all at the same time, right? They have their time to shine, for lack of a better words, where progesterone is high for that middle part of the cycle, but it drops down towards the periods of estrus, right? When those ewes are in heat. We have estrus estrogen that's responsible for that. And then we have LH that releases that egg cell. So notice that there's a tandem kind of relationship here, where not every hormone is high at the same time or low at the same time. And really put together that prostaglandin hormone, seeing how that is increasing at the same time that progesterone is decreasing, right? So as we think forward, and I'll give some examples here, that's how these hormones have relationships with one another and work together to form this whole cycle, so that our ewes and our does ovulate like they're supposed to and are able to release egg cells and to be fertilized. Okay, so back to our initial question here of what do we use these hormones for? And I mentioned that we use them to control cyclicity, right? So I put up what we just spent seems like forever talking about, right? And put up that reproductive cycle, and we're trying to mimic that, and we're trying to control that so that we know exactly when maybe ovulation is happening if we're AIing. But going one step further, the events that we're really focused on is that event of releasing that egg cell, so ovulation. If we're AIing our ewes or our does, it's really critical that we get that timing down, because we want the lifespan of that egg cell to match up with the lifespan of the sperm cell, and that gives us the best chance at reproductive success in those situations. The other instance that maybe we're trying to kind of fine tune or pinpoint the timing of is the lifespan of that corpus luteum, or being able to alter that lifespan to where we know that if we kill off that CL and progesterone isn't being produced anymore, then that ewe or that doe is going to have a chance to ovulate right after that. Because remember, as progesterone decreases, that gives us a chance for estrogen to increase and for LH to eventually increase to release that egg cell. So in a table then, listing out those hormones and kind of what they do, right? So whether you're visual and see that in the picture of the estrous cycle or listed in that table, LH is the hormone that's responsible for inducing ovulation or inducing the release of that egg cell so it can be fertilized. And a product that there's been a lot of research done in this area to test different products and different hormones and see how they can work in best to a synchronization protocol. And so one product that has kind of the activity like LH is called PG600. So the next hormone on the list then is progesterone. So that's produced during that majority middle part of the estrous cycle. And I know I mentioned it several times, but it's important that we remember that progesterone prevents ovulation. So there's not going to be any egg cells released to get fertilized as long as that progesterone is high. And a product that has this hormone is a cedar. The next hormone then is prostaglandin, and so that is responsible for killing that or lysing that corpus luteum so that it's not active anymore, and we're decreasing progesterone levels. So you see that in the green line where it increases, then progesterone decreases. And a product that is this hormone is luteolase. And so it's really important for me to mention here that, like I said, there's been lots of research done in this area to figure out how these hormones work and how we can use them with synchronization. But it's important to know that PG600 and luteolase are not approved for use in sheep and goats. And so while there is research done on them, this requires veterinarian oversight and a strong relationship with a veterinarian so they can advise you on breeding protocols and advise you on these hormones and how to use them in your animals. So having a relationship with your veterinarian is really important when we think about synchronization. Okay, so that leads us to finally getting to the point where maybe we can put this into practice and actually use it in our flock or in our herd. So I put up this figure once again just to show what cyclicity looks like. And when we think about sheep and goats, there's a seasonality aspect to this, right? Where fairly shortly here, our days are going to be decreasing and those animals are going to start to cycle. And so keeping that in mind, where this process is occurring on the ovaries of those ewes or those does that are already cycling. And so one of the, I mentioned earlier how you might use synchronization if you want to try to have more kids and lambs in a concentrated time period. And so synchronization is a technology in itself that doesn't have to be used with artificial insemination. So the research that's been done in this area has really focused on finding pretty user-friendly protocols that are pretty low maintenance, and they're designed to be used with natural service. So this means that they're not highly fine-tuned, right? We don't have the timing of ovulation or estrus down to the hour like we might need to with artificial insemination. Instead, ewes and does are going to come into heat over a several-day period because it's less synchronized, and that's by design because we don't want to overwhelm our ram or buck power. And so these types of protocols, they work to manipulate that lifespan of the CL, like I mentioned before. And so if we can target that CL and act on it to where progesterone levels decrease, then we know that those animals are going to come into heat fairly soon after that. And so that's why there's a several day period where you might see ewes or does in heat. And that's, again, that's by design when using natural service. Okay, nextly then, we have synchronization that we might want to use in conjunction with artificial insemination. And I mentioned before how it's pretty critical that we line up the lifespan of that egg cell with the lifespan of the sperm cell to best to maximize our reproductive success, right? So it's much more critical in these situations that we get our timing down pretty specifically. And so we need to have a little bit more of a involved protocol than we would if we would use natural service. And so in protocols that are used with AI, a lot of times a seeder will be in for a certain length of time. And then right after you remove that seeder, there's going to be somewhere around a 2-day period where you'll see ewes and does come into heat. And that's how you can time it based off of when they show heat or when they express estrus. Then you can time it to when they are AI'd. And so the reason this works, or the reason why the research has, what we've gained, I guess, from the research in this area is finding out exactly the timing that needs to be used. And so we're gonna go back to the typical estrus cycle here. And in a typical estrus cycle, the period of progesterone or CL lifespan, or when progesterone is high, would be somewhere between 11 to 15 days, depending on the individual animal that you might be working with. So if we line that up with the protocol that we just talked through, you'll see how closely it mimics what's naturally occurring in a ewe, right? So we have a period of progesterone exposure followed by prostaglandin to where ovulation and estrus is going to happen right after that. And so this is just an example, right? I mentioned how critical it is that you work with veterinarians because protocols there's several out there, right? This is just one example, and they're going to have a recommendation that's going to be best and that they're most comfortable with. So this is just an example, but I put it up there to illustrate how they mimic, how they're developed to mimic what's naturally occurring in these females, and that's how we can maximize our reproductive success. So the key points here, the first thing is to really know your goal. Operation to operation is different, management-wise, as well as the end goal, right? So if you have the goal of maybe you just want to increase the number of kids or lambs that are born in a 3-week period, your synchronization strategy will likely be different than someone who wants to AI. And that's why there's several protocols out there, and it's important to know that so that you can best use your facilities financially. You get the best option for what you need, and then also so that you can be successful for your specific goal. Know that there's different products and they all have different jobs, right? So I mentioned that at the very beginning, and hopefully throughout that was pretty evident too, in that each hormone has its own job. And I mentioned how they have their own shape and their own size. And some of them are a little bit more finicky to changes in, say, temperature, or you don't want to have something sitting on the dash of your pickup in direct sunlight or on a shelf in the barn where it might freeze. Just knowing how to handle these things and store them and use them correctly. And your veterinarians are going to be great resources for that as well. Timing is everything when it comes to synchronization. We're mimicking something that's naturally occurring that is pretty specific in the physiology of a ewe or a doe. And so especially when it comes to AIing, being precise and being accurate on your timing in those protocols is really important. And then lastly is to plan ahead. That's everything down to facilities, to labor, to having everything you need on hand, right? We don't want to be at the last minute and realize we don't have something, and our pregnancy rates hinge on it, right? So plan ahead, know what you need, know what your goal is, and consult people that can help you.
Well, thanks, Lacey. I think, yeah, you really covered a lot of things relating to timing of estrus synchronization, and that is particularly important. And even the pre-breeding management things that we've already discussed. When we think about incorporating advanced reproductive technologies like artificial insemination and embryo transfer, the importance of those management strategies and synchronization protocols is even more enhanced when we talk about incorporating timed AI, and in particular, depending on the different technique, the timing of that AI is different because semen is deposited in a different location based on technique. And so this section will kind of cover those different techniques and some other considerations to make when we're thinking about incorporating artificial insemination. And so why do we incorporate artificial insemination, and why has it gained so much popularity? It's already really, really popular in the beef industry and the dairy industry, but even more recently in the sheep and goat industries, we've seen a rapid adoption of artificial insemination that at times has been limited by varying success rates. But in general, it allows us to capitalize on superior genetics at a faster rate. And so we can incorporate these genetics at a much faster rate by being able to increase the number of breeding opportunities per ram or buck ejaculate. And so artificial insemination is also commonly used to shorten the breeding season. It can also obviously subsequently shorten the lambing season. And so much like synchronization, when we use AI, we're also shortening that breeding and lambing season. We can also reduce the number of sires that we need to have on site. And so that not only reduces feed costs, but it also reduces the management of those sometimes bothersome sires that can create issues if they get out, or perhaps if they have biosecurity issues and that kind of thing. And lastly, when we think about capitalizing on superior genetics, oftentimes we're incorporating other sires outside of our own operation. And so we can do that in a more biosecure way if we incorporate fresh and frozen semen through artificial insemination rather than bringing those rams and bucks on site to breed and having that level of risk of managing someone else's livestock. But another thing to pay attention to and maybe just be aware of is that there's a number of considerations to think about if you're trying to incorporate artificial insemination. And I stray away from calling these cons of artificial insemination, because I think you have to weigh out the genetic improvement that you're getting at times with the use of superior genetics with the cost of artificial insemination. And I think that will vary from operation and be a case-by-case situation. But there is upfront investment cost of semen cost, actually paying to artificially inseminate when we're using some advanced technical experienced technicians. And then, of course, success is never guaranteed, and it's never guaranteed in natural service either. However, when we think about sheep and goat artificial insemination, it has historically been highly variable in success rates, and that's been, from a research standpoint, been studied quite a bit and has varied based from breed to breed. Seasonality plays a big role in the success rate. As well as the type of AI program that you're incorporating, whether it be the technique that you're using, the synchronization protocol, whether it be the semen quality of that sample that you're trying to inseminate. And so among this, it requires precise pre-breeding management. And I kind of already talked a little bit about how even pre-breeding nutritional management and estrus synchronization, without those two things, I think we're going to have trouble incorporating artificial insemination at a highly successful rate. And so managing and priming those females for artificial insemination and priming those stud bucks and rams for semen collection is a really important factor to consider when you're trying to incorporate this technology. And then, of course, depending on the technique that you're using, requires some level of technical expertise. as well as veterinary oversight if we're thinking about incorporating laparoscopic technology. And so in the sheep and goat world, it's kind of evolved over time. And a lot of that has been driven by success rate and conception rate of where semen is deposited into the reproductive tract. And so there's three main types of artificial insemination that have been used in sheep and goats, and now especially when we talk about sheep artificial insemination, that's primarily now done laparoscopically, which is a minimally invasive surgical technique that deposits semen directly into the uterine horn. And the reason that that's been so successful and deemed the gold standard, especially in sheep AI, is because we're bypassing oftentimes a very difficult and rigid cervix to pass an AI gun through. And we're depositing directly into the uterine horn, which is only about 3 to 4 inches away from the site of fertilization. So we can see conception and rates of 60 to 85% and sometimes even higher, depending on a number of different things. But in goats primarily, we do see some other types of artificial insemination deployed across the country. And transvaginal or splashing is still really popular in goats. It's one that I still encourage producers to utilize fresh semen with, because that semen still has to travel the same amount of distance as it would in a natural cervix situation. But essentially in this technique, semen is deposited at the base of the cervix through the vagina. And that technique has been more successful in goats than it has in sheep. Lastly, the transcervical option is probably the one that's the most similar to being used in cattle. And that's where an AI gun or a pipette and a syringe with semen is actually passed either partially or all the way through the cervix. And that technique is again one that's more commonly used in goats than in the sheep, based on conception rates previously recorded. But transcervical provides some options predominantly on the goat side because they do have a little bit more of a flexible cervix that you can actually pass that gun at least partially or all the way through that cervix to deposit that semen directly into the cervix of the uterus. So just briefly, I'll touch base on a few things. For the sake of time, I'll probably not cover everything here, but I think it's important to recognize the different techniques. We talked about vaginal splashing or transvaginal insemination. Again, this is semen deposited at the base of the cervix through the vagina. This is a very non-invasive procedure. Generally, we recommend the use of fresh semen with at least 70% progressive motility, and requires very little supplies. Essentially, you need a pipette and a syringe to deposit the semen, and sometimes you can see in this picture you can use a vaginal speculum, but it's often not required. This technique does not require you to use synchronization. Instead, you can use visual display of heat detection or estrus with the use of teaser bucks. Tail flagging and fin thrubbing are pretty common on the goat side. But again, not a technique ideal for sheep, and success will vary in goats. It really is dependent on semen quality and the timing of insemination being as precise as possible. So when you see the onset of estrus signs, typically that semen needs to be deposited 24 to 48 hours later. But we see conception rates with this technique in goats probably around 30%. And as you can see, as we move forward, as we get closer to the site of fertilization in the oviduct, we see conception rates increase. And so that's kind of the pros and cons of picking a technique, is determining, do you have high quality semen and feel confident that splashing it could be an effective method, or do you need something that's a little bit closer to that site of fertilization? For the sake of time, I won't play this video, but I think it's an excellent demonstration by Dr. Tad Thompson from the Reproductive Specialty Group. That QR code there will take you directly to that YouTube video. This is a relatively simple process. It's essentially and relatively inexpensive as well. RSG does sell these artificial insemination splashing kits, and you can get 10 splashing enough for 10 artificial inseminations for as little as $16. So relatively inexpensive when we think about AI techniques across the industry. The next type is transcervical or cervical AI. Again, this is depositing semen a little bit closer to the site of fertilization in the cervix or sometimes in the uterus. And so this placement is typically, cervical placement is typically a little bit lower from a conception rate standpoint at 40 to 60% when that semen is deposited 1 to 3 centimeters within the cervix. And then uterine placement is typically 3.5 to 5 centimeters through the cervix. And you can see upwards of a 65% conception rate. And you have the opportunity to use fresh or frozen semen. Here, the supplies needed are simply a vaginal speculum, lubricant, as well as an artificial insemination light. So you can see the point or the opening of the cervix there in the right-hand corner. And then you can utilize a pipette and a syringe, or you can utilize an AI gun to penetrate that opening and deposit semen in the cervix or the uterus. When we think about a technique that's really becoming popular industry-wide and particularly popular on the sheep side is the laparoscopic AI or LAP AI. This is a minor surgical procedure that requires a trained technician and veterinary oversight and a timed insemination protocol or estrus sync protocol, very similar to the one that Lacey mentioned earlier. Again, conception rates vary based on a number of different things. Predominantly, they vary based on semen quality and timing of that estrus synchronization protocol. We can see on average conception rates be around 70% when using fresh semen and closer to 50% when we use frozen semen. And again, that's the reason that we see higher conception rates is we're depositing directly into the uterine horn, most of the time both uterine horns, and that semen or sperm only has to travel 3 to 4 inches to that site of fertilization in the oviduct. Success does vary, very good. We can see upwards of 80%, and it's usually about 10% less in goats. They do have a greater internal fat, and it's typically a touch harder to do goats from what I've heard from technicians than it is to do sheep. But good would be 60 to 70% in sheep, average 50 to 60, and poor is anything less than 50% in sheep and less than 35% in goats. This indicates likely the use of poor semen, a poor synchronization protocol or follow through, severe stress prior to or after insemination, and or poor technique. Because this requires a trained technician and one with veterinary oversight and low-level sedation, typically this is done through host sites or dedicated facilities, and those are provided by specialty service companies, and there's a number of them. This is not an exhaustive list. However, these are the companies that probably have made the biggest impact on the sheep and goat industry from a LAP AI standpoint and an embryo transfer standpoint. But there are also a number of individual service providers that will often host sites or come to on-farm sites when we have 50 to 100 head to travel for. This is Dr. Justin Luther is who we use from Reproductive Services Company. Hedinger hosts an artificial insemination day in the summer, and I'll share a little bit more about that program if you're interested. But typically, it's recommended not to transport livestock and females over 4 hours to a host site. And there's still a lot of research being done in this area. I know there's some more data that supports traveling to the host site 24 hours ahead of time may improve conception rates. But this is still a very fluid research area that we're trying to optimize for producers. In each technician, whether you use a specialty service company or an individual service provider, will have a list of best practices. And I think the best piece of advice that I can give you is to trust their opinion. They obviously are hired based on their ability to do the job. And they want to succeed as well. And so they want to see as high conception rates as you do. And so they often have a list of best practices that have worked best for them in their insemination protocol. Won't dive too deep into this because I think Lacey did a very good job explaining estrus synchronization. But from a cost standpoint, we're looking at around $20 to $30 per head. And the majority of that cost actually comes from the CEDAR itself. But protocols will vary by technician. They are timed synchronization protocols, so they typically are a little bit more intense than a natural service synchronization protocol. But oftentimes those specialty service providers or individual providers will provide you a protocol. An example of that is the one provided here at the bottom from last year's AI Day in Hettinger, where that CEDAR was inserted for 14 days, and they were dosed with Lutalice and PG600 at 7 and 14 days. Other suggestions pretty much across the board is to pull feed and water prior to insemination. We're pulling feed about 24 hours and water 12 to 14 hours prior to insemination. This allows that gut fill to really come down and allows them more access to they actually have to peer into the abdominal cavity in order to locate those uterine horns to provide insemination. And so if we can pull them off water, that sure helps those technicians be quicker in identifying and locating the uterine horn and also throughout the insemination process. There's also some discussion of whether to use heat detection, and it's something I do recommend from the standpoint of, you're putting a lot of money and sometimes several hundreds of dollars into a lap AI insemination. Utilizing heat detection can help you identify ewes that may have not responded to the synchronization protocol. And it's important that you can utilize teaser bucks to actually identify which ewes have responded appropriately and would be ideal for insemination. So just briefly, I'll walk through this because I find it really interesting, and I think that it's important to know what to expect with LAP AI. From as general as possible, this procedure begins with ewe or doe sedation. This is a low-level sedation. Typically, animals are still able to stand and actually can be tipped onto a cradle, sheared and sterilized prior to the surgical technique. And then the LAP AI itself, the actual insemination of the semen only takes about 1 to 2 minutes per animal. So it's a very quick process as far as the insemination itself, but a lot more prep work beforehand. And then, of course, there's some post-procedure care and monitoring considerations that we'll discuss. The LAP AI technique is relatively non-invasive, or it's relatively minorly invasive. So typically it requires the ewe to be inverted in a cradle, and that essentially just shifts her internal organs outside of the plane, surgical plane. And then 2 cannula incisions are made, and these are incisions just through the skin, and they're about nail size, like fingernail size incisions, maybe 1 to 2 centimeters on either side of the abdominal cavity. And then these cannula incisions are made to insert a camera and light endoscope, as well as a manipulating probe, which is then replaced with an AI gun at time of insemination. And so this figure down here gives you a really good idea of what that looks like internally. And so you can see this here on the right side is that endoscope that has a camera and light attached to it, so that technician can directly see inside the abdominal cavity to locate the uterine horn. And this cannula incision is made for the AI gun in order to inseminate. At this point, a trocar or a blunted needle is used to go through the abdominal cavity, and this actually slides directly through those layers. That way at removal, everything kind of goes back into place, and it's a relatively easy healing or low stress healing process. Visualization of the uterine horns is really important. Oftentimes, technicians will utilize CO2 gas, a small amount, to kind of inflate that abdominal cavity in order to gain greater visual. And then, of course, insemination is done to each uterine horn. Lastly, after insemination, the cannulas are removed, and the skin is simply closed with skin staples, and a liquid bandage is applied across that skin staple and incision mark. And then user and does are carefully removed from the cradle, placed sternal, and monitored until standing, and transport isn't recommended until they are standing and alert. Some post-insemination keys to success is that ewes and does should immediately be returned to their normal environment. And transporting them immediately following insemination is actually better. It's encouraged not to wait. We're trying to get them back into their normal environment so we can establish pregnancy in a low-stress environment. We want to maintain an increased play and nutrition for around 10 days, or that flushing ration about 10 days, as this supports embryo survival and implantation. And again, that's through cereal grains rather than legumes. And clover exposure has also been shown to reduce conception rates post-insemination. So we want to avoid grazing pastures that have an abundance of clover. We want to avoid unnecessary stress for at least 10 days, but I would recommend, and many would recommend, unnecessary stress for 30 days after insemination. And this includes limiting any handling and transport after their return to their normal environment, holding off turning and cleaning up rams. Oftentimes those rams can be really active and cause some undue stress there. So holding those off until about 10 days after insemination is recommended. And then monitoring environmental conditions and making appropriate accommodations for extreme conditions. If you're hauling home in the next week or big storms coming through, making sure that those ewes and does are in an environment that protects them from the undue stress is really important to the success rate. The other big piece of this, if you want to incorporate artificial insemination specifically for LAP AI, is some considerations when purchasing semen. As an industry, there's not really a quality control for semen processing and quality at this point for AI. And so it's important that we're not only purchasing semen that's been proven, but also semen that can last and live in the reproductive tract long enough to reach that site of fertilization and accomplish its goal. Typically, semen is bought either directly from a producer. There's a number of different online sales that offer semen options. And then some specialty services providers, and in particular of what I know, RSG offers genetic catalog, very similar to the beef industry in that way, of what semen is available at those sites that is available for purchase. But it's incredibly important to ask the important questions when you're buying direct or online. And those important questions are related to semen quality. So the concentration of those straws, what are their previous conception rates, post-fall quality and longevity, how long can it last post-fall, are all critical components that, especially if you're using an individual service provider, those are questions they like to know and be aware of. What to buy? Typically, semen is sold frozen or fresh. Frozen is typically sold by individual straws or pellets, and these widely range across the sheep and goat industry, but on average, $100 to $250 a straw is fairly common. From a fresh standpoint, you're typically buying full or half jumps. Those can cost on average $2,500 to $5,000 per jump. In general, they estimate that you can use that fresh or that full jump for 30 head. However, oftentimes they do end up providing more semen than what can inseminate 30 head, and so having 5 to 10 more synchronized would be recommended if you're using fresh semen from a jump situation to avoid overloading semen volume per female. Transport and storage is very similar across the industries. Typically, it's transported on dry liquid nitrogen tank for frozen semen, And then dry strippers are typically available for chilled fresh semen. Technicians and specialty service groups will help arrange semen transport and delivery for host sites as well. So always ask if that's a possibility as well. And with that, we'll kind of just wrap up here and hopefully be able to answer some questions and have a nice discussion on some of these things that we've talked about today. Did want to throw this out there. We are offering a host site on July 15th, 2025. These services are provided by Dr. Justin Luther with Reproductive Services Company. And if you have any questions related to that, want to be involved with it, if you're in 4 to 5 hours of Hettinger, let me know. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Rachel Gibbs and Dr. Lacey Quail, and again, those that have joined us here for this evening's function here in June. Now, kindly understand how exciting and how excited I am in the state of North Dakota to be surrounded by talented experts as well. So, thank you, ladies, for sharing your talents and your thoughts. If you have some questions, and of course, our individuals and presenters have had access to those questions as well. I think that we'll just go back, just in generalities, Rachel. And I thought this was a good one. I'll touch on it a little bit and then pass it on because it makes a good sense as we kind of think about it. It says, how do you dry off your ewes from weaning, but start your supplementation for breeding? And so my quick, opinion, I thought that was a great question. But my personal opinion is that hopefully we have a little bit of time in between those. And so even if we were to wean those at a later period of time, is that I think even from a milk production, if you decrease the amount of energy and the amount of nutrients that you're providing for them for approximately a week, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, that should provide us enough time. But I think if we give ourselves a week, maybe that's 2 weeks. The other thing is that keep into consideration is the cycling of the ewe and or doe themselves. And so just because we wean them, they may be cycling, they may not be cycling. And so I think that there's some time in between there that's probably not as big of a challenge, but I'll task that to my colleagues, Rachel first.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. I think that is also an excellent question and agree that when you're only lambing or kidding twice or once a year, that there's plenty of time for you to pull off that additional weight and get them into maintenance conditions or dry them off essentially prior to the breeding season. I will say for those that are lambing and kidding twice a year, it becomes more difficult. You have a shorter turnaround to get those in peak condition. But I think if we set them up during the pre-breeding phase, so 60 days ahead of the breeding season, if we get them into a body condition score of a 2 to 2.5, and they increase throughout pregnancy to a 3.5 to a 4, by the time they hit peak lactation, they're actually they're in a negative energy balance and going ahead and pulling off some weight there. And so I think it's a balance of meeting peak lactation demands, but at weaning, we're doing a really dramatic loss in nutrient availability. And so I think that's how we can successfully dry them off and get them ready for the next breeding season. Lacey, do you have something?
You guys covered it well. My only extra thought was, especially in that accelerated system, maybe not waiting until the day you wean to start feeding something at a lower energy balance, right? We mentioned that week time point to give the ewes a chance to not produce quite as much milk, to help with that as well. So yeah, I agree with everything you guys said.
I think we've got a good multi-species kind of question. I appreciate our colleague that made the inquiry. And so the question is swine people feed sugar prior to breeding a gilt or sow? Will the same help for sheep or goats? And so again, I'm going to take a stab at it, and I believe the difference is the monogastric to ruminants. And so, see, Lacey was shaking her head like, okay, good, Travis is on the right path. And so we're providing the energy and the proteins and all of our resources in the rumen of both of our sheep and goats. The dextrose and the sugars that you would be providing to the swine animals is obviously a lot simpler. Lacey, you wanted it. You look like you got the answer. Hopefully I'm on the right track. Sugar's not our answer. We just need to increase the total amount of total digestible nutrients for the animals.
Yeah, no, I just more or less was thinking I was on the right track.
Okay,
But
good.
yeah, the point is that we want to increase energy, right? And a monogastric is going to do that we can do that with different things with a monogastric than we can with a ruminant. So as long as we're increasing energy, I think we're on the right track there.
Okay, to both of our talented people, and primarily Lacey, I'll let you lead this off as well because you saw these. Does PG 600 contain FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and then also probably luteinizing hormone, right? And so there's some derivations of those, and then also the inquiry came from a lutealized standpoint, and there was some questions that probably are more just specific names of prostaglandins that are very similar. And so I'm going to tackle those as one of just PG 600 and just kind of utilize in generalities of the functions that are available for us.
Sure. So PG 600 is a product that it's not the hormone that it does contain has activity like gonadotropins, right? So that's FSH and LH, but it's not those specific hormones. So that's kind of the difference there, right? And why it gets used. But as far as the lutealized comment, yeah, I that was a oversight on my part as far as, that's just one example. Just because it's a common example doesn't mean that it's the only example. And there are several prostaglandin products out there, and there's been research done on a lot of them as far as different products and even comparing products. And as far as I'm aware, there's no difference or I guess advantage of one or the other, right? A lot of it might be personal preference of whoever you're working with. So yeah, hopefully that clears up some of that.
Lacey, but the hormone HCG in PG 600 still binds to those same receptors and acts like those gonadotropins.
Yes,
So
the only way that it can act like that hormone is by binding to that receptor, right? So that's a tricky example, and that's something that we don't like on the cattle side of things we don't run into. So, but it's a great question, and whoever you're working with is going to likely have some insight for you there as well.
They're different to the labels, but several of them act very similarly. And so I think both of you scheduled that well. And in fact, Rachel said at the end is that if we so choose to use some of the reproduction technologies, first off, we like to have our veterinarian on board that can help us out. And then if we so choose to do artificial insemination or embryo transfers, that colleague that we're working with, I thought that was great, Rachel. Like, hey, you got to believe in them, okay? They want to win. They've been working at it, and we really appreciate kind of if and what they've done. Just a smidge off topic, but I think still valuable is pre-breeding vaccinations. Okay, and so I like to think that if we think about it from a Clostridiums perfringens C and D or CD and T, which is your CD and T and tetanus, is that I like to at least provide that available to our ewes approximately a month before. Also, that can be given to rams as well if you so aspire. Now, I think when we dig a little bit deeper of reproductive diseases that can happen, is that we can also talk about obviously either Campylobacter or chlamydia, and those do happen. But also depending on the efficacy of the vaccinations, and if you feel as though you're at risk, then that may or may not be something that I consider at least top of mind in vaccination. Now, the one thing I would say is that if we do have that, and then we start to see any type of abortions, and if you have a first abortion, this is my personal opinion, is that you have a first abortion, that's a bad luck. If you have a second abortion, we're treating this and we're calling the veterinarian as soon as we can to even treat it from the standpoint of getting us back on pace. Now, I'm not saying that people, if you feel as though that's prudent to provide vaccinations, that can be good for you, but sometimes there's different strains and sometimes we may or may not catch what we need to. So, sorry, Rachel and Lacey, I'll let you task that of pre-breeding vaccinations if you have anything to add.
yeah, I think that pre-breeding season is an excellent time to do those annual booster vaccines like CD and T. But I think beyond that, when we think about vaccinating for reproductive diseases, where is the balance between risk management and cost? is oftentimes the conversation that I hear of, are you at increased risk? For instance, did you bring in a large majority of um, virgin or ewe lamb or replacement ewe lambs or does into your operation that you don't know their history? And at that point, you may have an increased risk and an increased need to vaccinate for reproductive diseases. But I think working with a veterinarian, there's some other options for prevention that you can utilize under the discretion of the veterinarian to prevent those reproductive diseases from causing a significant issue. But I think really importantly, anytime that you see an abortion, noting at what point in gestation it occurred and taking those samples and getting them tested is of the utmost importance.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. We're going to stay preventive, all right? And so the inquiry next comes, and you've seen these in the chats from mineral supplementation. And I'm going to take the cheaper way out and say that I believe in the companies that help to put together these minerals because they know more about it than I do. But Rachel or Lacey, what is your thoughts in terms of just mineral supplementation, particularly as we think through this summer, and again, depending on what feedstuffs that we're providing them and what's available.
Yeah, I think the NRC does a really nice job of picking out those specific vitamins and minerals that you need to meet their nutrient requirements. I think beyond that, a lot of it is related to semen quality and supplementing minerals, specifically in the pre-breeding season for males. And maybe Lacey can talk more on the female side. But for males, selenium and vitamin E, as well as zinc and manganese, are really, really important to semen production and the biological development of sperm. And so without meeting those requirements, we're limiting our semen quality. So yes, I 100% believe in mineral supplementation and really like the use of those fortified supplements that have a higher a bioavailability of those nutrients in them.
I think on the female side, I mean, it's similar in that, you don't want to start a mineral supplementation program after the fact, right? Pre-breeding, and I'm not a nutritionist, right? It's important to work with people that, like Travis said, that know this in and out. And when it comes to reproduction, on the female side, not only so that we're producing healthy gametes, but the maternal environment, right, where that those embryos are developing, there's a lot of coming and going from minerals and vitamins there to make sure that uterine environment is healthy too. So yeah, definitely find someone to work with on that. It's of the utmost importance, and if you don't have it dialed in, it can be pretty evident. So.
Thank you, ladies. Just a couple more questions, and I think there's a good one there that said, "Hey, what about out of season breeding and protocols?" And in fact, an inquiry that we can add on to that is, I mean, we use MGA in cattle, and just from that standpoint of if that's an option or if even if it's labeled for sheep and goats. But in generalities, before I pass it to you, is that I think a lot of these work at a high level. Okay, Lacey did a great job of discussing what happens for the most part if those animals are cycling. But again, we have those resources that help get us there, right? And so, big picture, at least from out of season, what happens in my head is that cedars are the cool tool. Okay, so our controlled internal drug release that we have to get us moving and get that cycling, but ladies, in generality, we don't always do it and follow the rules of nature. So, what if we want to do it at a different time?
Yeah, exactly what you mentioned, that those ewes that are out of season they're not ovulating on their own, right? So we have to kind of go at things from a different perspective to promote that. MGA is not labeled for use in sheep. It's only labeled for use in heifers. The out of season portion, it's going to be even more important for the whoever you're working with. Their protocol is going to be specific, and the hormones are going to be slightly different than what you would use in season, right? Because that ewe or that doe isn't cycling on her own. But yeah, cedars are a huge part of that. That progesterone is crucial when ewes or does are not cycling.
Yeah, I think on the out of season breeding, there's a couple of different things you can do. And even from a natural synchronization standpoint, I know here at the Hettinger REC, we do have a fall lambing herd, and we keep replacements out of that herd. And so selecting for out of season breeding is an excellent tool, but also utilizing the ram effect or the natural exposure 2 to 4 weeks, or sorry, 2 weeks, 14 days prior to the breeding season has been shown to induce cyclicity in those females. And that's something that we utilize here yearly. So there's definitely options for out of season breeding. And again, I think Lacey hit the nail on the head from the standpoint of you have to understand what you're using and when and how it's going to work to really utilize those out of season protocols.
Outstanding. Thank you, ladies. And so thanks for adding in, Rachel, is that even as you think about it from a ram effect, is having a ram even within fence line, right? And so, again, we got to have fences that work. But if access and exposure to the ram slash buck, of knowing that it's time and that we're allowing those animals to then do their female cycles and to get that moving is a great point to add to it. And so our last question that we're going to have tonight was one that looks at the inquiry was artificial insemination versus natural service. And so maybe that's a vague question, and that could have been our first one or our last one. But what I would like to thank you for before we even kind of finish this is that realizing that we have to have the rams slash bucks that have passed a breeding soundness exam and that are ready to go, and then our ewes slash does that are cycling as well. And so without doing the fundamentals, and that's why we had Dr. Gibbs talk about just nutrition in generalities. Also, from an animal health standpoint, if they're not at a good spot, we're not going to expect things. And Lacey showed just our optimization of nutrients that are available is that if we don't get that groundwork done, it's not particularly going to matter. And the other thing is that people, when they inquire and say, well, maybe natural service is the answer for me, I'd just pose the question is that, well, we don't get all of them bred in the first cycle either, right? And so at least if you so choose to move to AI, that allows you the first option and then potentially even a follow up. So that's my last question is just the thought process here as we kind of think about all the technologies and maybe it's the advantages for AI, maybe it's how we think natural service can be home base. Lacey, I'm going to let you start this and we'll let Rachel throw a hammer at it.
Okay. I I think you did a great job of saying how it boils down to management, right? And that baseline management really needs to be tuned in if we're going to be successful with reproduction in any sort of program. I think, and the first service conception too, in a natural service setting, not every producer is going to know what their first cycle pregnancy rate is, and comparing that to, we think about all that we're trying to control in an AI setting and all of the steps that have the opportunity for things to maybe go awry, right? Whether that's stress on the animal, whether that's semen quality and how the semen is handled, whether that's how well you've complied to the protocol, right? There's several dominoes that have the opportunity to get out of line to where they don't all get knocked over how they're supposed to. So that's just another opportunity for management to step in and circumvent some of those things, to really be in tune with how accurate you are and precise, and just when we're taking over some of those jobs, we have to take the responsibility for them too, right? When we're taking over for the animal itself. So.
Yeah, Lacey, I think you hit all the points that I was going to talk about as well. And I think as we think about incorporating AI, you have to kind of weigh out what your production goals are. If there's a certain area of your operation or you productivity or lamb growth and function that you want to improve, there's advantages to using some elite superior genetics and incorporating those. And oftentimes you have to incorporate them through artificial insemination, or that's often the method that's used. And so I think, again, pre-breeding management is critical for natural service, but probably tenfold more important if you're going to incorporate some timed AI and increasing those conception rates. But you could always, like Travis said, start with AI in mind and maybe UAI some use and have a backup plan, have a live cover option after insemination to catch those that didn't AI.
I think that's an opportunity too, Rachel. If you know, say something happens out of control, whether it's weather-wise or personnel-wise, to where you were set up for AI, and maybe the protocol didn't get handled correctly, you know, understanding what those hormones do and where they're at in their cycle and how it works can help you pivot to a different circumstance, like maybe with natural service, to where you can still, you know, still have a successful breeding season and you don't don't lose out completely, right?
Thank you, Dr. Rachel Gibbs, Dr. Lacey Quail, for their talents in the sheep and goat reproduction area for this particular webinar that we have hosted by the University of Minnesota and North Dakota State University, where we are driven to discover and we are extending knowledge and changing lives. Hopefully, you enjoy your June and have a glorious and successful and profitable summer in the sheep and goat industry. Thanks for joining us. Our next function is July 9. We will have a market sheep and goat outlook on pricing and what's going on in our industry. So feel free to join us on July 9. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.